For 30 years, I smiled through gritted teeth as my in-laws mocked everything about me, my background, my career, even the way I decorated my own home. To them, I was just the middle-class girl who was lucky enough to marry into their prestigious family. At every family gathering, they reminded me of my place beneath them and my husband. He loved me in private, but in front of them, his silence was deafening. They thought I was weak. They thought I had nothing to offer. But while they were busy looking down on me, I was quietly building something they could never imagine. When they finally told me I should learn to contribute, after decades of humiliation, I decided it was time to reveal the truth that I had owned their family estate for years without them knowing. If you've ever been underestimated or disrespected by those who should have supported you, this story is for you. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to Outlaw Alley for more real stories of revenge and resilience. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you secretly held all the power I was never supposed to fit into the Thompson family? From the moment I walked through the doors of their grand Philadelphia estate, I knew I was being measured and found lacking. I grew up in a modest neighborhood. My parents were hardworking people, my father a school teacher, my mother a nurse. We didn't have designer clothes or summer homes, but we had dignity and we valued hard work. When I met Thomas in college, none of that seemed to matter. He loved my ambition, my creativity, and the way I saw beauty in simple things. I thought love was enough. But love doesn't silence judgmental whispers at fancy dinner tables. It doesn't shield you from the sharp eyes of a mother-in-law like Beatrice Thompson. Beatrice was the kind of woman who could compliment you and insult you in the same breath. "Oh, Eleanor, that dress is so practical. It's nice to see someone who isn't obsessed with fashion." Or, "How wonderful that you're still working. I suppose some women enjoy keeping busy." The first few years of marriage were a harsh lesson in patience. Every family gathering felt like walking into a battlefield, except the weapons were smiles and passive-aggressive remarks. Thomas would squeeze my hand under the table, a silent apology for every comment he let slide. He wasn't cruel. He was just conditioned in the Thompson family appearances were everything, and standing up to Beatrice. That was unthinkable. I threw myself into my career as an architectural consultant. While they sipped champagne and discussed country club politics, I was designing spaces that people actually lived and worked in. But no matter how successful I became, it was never enough for them. "Consulting is such a flexible job, isn't it?" Beatrice would say. "As long as Thomas is providing, that's what matters." I learned to smile, to nod, to let their words wash over me like waves against a rock. Then when I was 35, my aunt passed away and left me a modest inheritance. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to spark something in me, an idea. Of course, when the Thompsons heard about it, they immediately suggested I donate it to the family foundation. Beatrice, with that patronizing smile, said, "Eleanor, dear, investing can be so complicated. Let us handle it for you. It's what family is for." That was the moment I decided I would never let them control me. Not my money. Not my future. I found a financial advisor. Not one of the flashy ones the Thompsons used to parade around, but someone smart. Someone who understood discretion. He suggested I invest in commercial real estate quietly through an LLC registered under my maiden name. It felt empowering. For the first time, I had something that was entirely mine. No judgment, no condescension, no Beatrice. I didn't tell Thomas. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew he wouldn't understand. He was comfortable living under the Thompson name, relying on old money and family connections. He didn't see the value in building something from the ground up. Years passed. Family dinners stayed the same jabs, the same fake smiles, the same suffocating air of superiority. But beneath that surface, I was growing stronger. Every property I bought, every smart deal I made, it was like adding bricks to a fortress they couldn't see. And then came 2008. The recession hit harder than anyone expected. Businesses collapsed. Fortunes shrank overnight. I noticed the subtle changes first. The rare wines at dinner were replaced with cheaper bottles. Conversations shifted from luxury vacations to tightening belts, but no one dared to admit they were struggling. Not to me, at least. After all, what could I possibly contribute? I was just the outsider, the woman they'd spent decades dismissing, but I knew I saw the cracks forming in their perfect facade. And I waited. Because patience had always been my greatest weapon. By the time the recession fully sank its teeth into the Thompson legacy, I had already weathered my own storms. Real estate wasn't immune to economic downturns, but I had been cautious smart. While they flaunted wealth, I built stability. But the Thompsons, they weren't prepared for a world where their last name wasn't enough. It started small. Beatrice canceled her annual charity gala, claiming it was time for others to take the spotlight. Thomas's brother quietly sold off his luxury car collection. There were whispers at family dinners, glances exchanged when I walked into the room, but no one ever said a word to me. I wasn't part of their inner circle. I never had been. Still, I watched and I listened. One afternoon, I overheard Beatrice on the phone in the garden. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, was laced with tension. "No, we can't default. I don't care what it takes. Keep it quiet. This family does not lose face." That was when I realized just how deep their troubles ran. I should have felt vindicated, maybe even smug, but I didn't. I felt calm because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't trapped by their sinking ship. In fact, I had quietly become the lifeboat. 3 years before that conversation, I had purchased the mortgage on the Thompson estate. It was a strategic investment, one of many in my growing portfolio. At the time, the holding company managing their debt was eager to offload assets. It was just business. But when I saw Beatrice's name on the paperwork, I'll admit it felt personal. I could have raised their payments, I could have enforced every clause, every penalty, but I didn't. Instead, I kept their terms reasonable, almost generous, because I wasn't interested in petty revenge. I was playing a longer game. Thomas, blissfully unaware of his family's precarious finances, continued as if nothing had changed. He still believed in the illusion of Thompson invincibility, and I let him. Months turned into years. The tension at family gatherings grew thicker. Beatrice's sharp tongue became even sharper, as if lashing out at me could somehow fix the cracks in her empire. "You know, Eleanor," she said during one particularly strained dinner, "some women would feel embarrassed contributing so little to family affairs, but I suppose not everyone is cut out for responsibility." I smiled, sipping my wine. There was power in knowing I didn't need to defend myself anymore, but the breaking point came sooner than I expected. Beatrice summoned everyone for a formal family dinner, a rare occasion when all the siblings, spouses, and even the grandchildren were expected to attend. Thomas was oblivious. He thought it was just another of his mother's traditions. But I could sense it. This wasn't about tradition. This was about survival. That evening, the atmosphere was suffocating. Gone were the extravagant centerpieces and imported delicacies. The dining room, once a symbol of opulence, felt hollow. Beatrice stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed. "I won't waste anyone's time." She began, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "As you all know, the economic climate has been challenging. Challenging, that was her word for financial ruin. She continued outlining how the family businesses had suffered temporary setbacks, how unexpected tax burdens and market shifts had forced difficult decisions. And then she dropped the bombshell. "The estate will need to be sold." Silence. For a family that prided itself on control, this was a public admission of failure. Beatrice's eyes landed on me, cold and calculating. "Thomas, Eleanor, I trust you'll understand that downsizing will be necessary. Perhaps this will be an opportunity for Eleanor to finally learn how to contribute in meaningful ways." The implication was clear. After years of enduring her insults, she still saw me as a burden, someone dependent on their crumbling wealth. I felt Thomas tense beside me, but as always, he said nothing. I looked around the table, faces filled with concern, pride wounded but intact. They still thought they held the power in this family. That was when I realized it was time to stop playing along. I placed my napkin gently on the table, stood up and said, "Excuse me for a moment." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, probably thinking I was too delicate to handle the truth. But I wasn't leaving because I was upset. I was leaving to make a phone call that would change everything. I stepped out onto the veranda, the cool Philadelphia air biting at my skin. Inside, I could still hear the low murmur of voices my in-laws likely speculating about how Thomas and I would cope with losing their estate. I took out my phone, scrolled to a familiar number and pressed call. It rang once. Ms. Thompson, my attorney, answered promptly. Always professional, "It's time," I said simply. "I'll be there in 10. As I stood there watching the moonlight dance across the manicured gardens, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. For 3 decades, I had endured their condescension. I had let them believe I was beneath them, not because I was weak, but because I knew that real power doesn't need to announce itself. When I returned to the dining room, Beatrice gave me a smug look as if she had already won. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked sweetly, her voice dripping with false concern. I just smiled and took my seat. 10 minutes later, the butler entered, his expression unusually tense. "Mrs. Thompson, there's a gentleman here to see Mrs. Eleanor Thompson. He says it's urgent." Beatrice's eyes narrowed in confusion. "Who on earth would be calling on you at this hour?" I didn't answer. I simply stood and walked to the foyer. My attorney, Mr. Caldwell, stood there with a leather-bound folder in hand. We exchanged a brief nod before I gestured for him to follow me back into the dining room. As we entered, the room fell silent. All eyes were on us, confused, curious, some even annoyed at the interruption. Beatrice was the first to speak, her tone sharp. "What is the meaning of this?" I took my place at the head of the table, her seat, and calmly laid the folder in front of me. "For years, I began, my voice steady. I've listened to every insult, every dismissive comment. I was content to let it go because I knew something none of you did. I opened the folder, revealing a stack of legal documents, titles, and financial statements. 3 years ago, when this family first started struggling, I purchased the mortgage on this estate through my investment company." The color drained from Beatrice's face. What are you talking about?" she stammered. "I'm saying," I continued, locking eyes with her, "that for the past 3 years, you've been living in my house. I've been your landlord." A gasp rippled through the room. Thomas looked at me, stunned. He had no idea. Beatrice, ever the matriarch, tried to regain control. "This is absurd. We would have known." "No," I cut her off, my tone sharper now. "You wouldn't, because I made sure everything was handled discreetly. I kept your payments manageable when I could have foreclosed the moment you defaulted." The weight of my words settled over them like a storm cloud. For once, Beatrice was speechless. Thomas finally found his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him, not with anger, but with quiet resignation. "Because you never asked, Thomas. You never thought I could be the one holding this family together." Silence. It was in that moment I realized there was no going back. I had crossed a line that had been drawn decades ago, a line they never imagined I'd have the courage or the means to step over. Beatrice's hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water, her facade cracking for the first time in years. "So what now?" she finally whispered, the defeat in her voice undeniable. I took a deep breath. This was the point of no return, not just for me, but for all of us. "I'm not here to evict you," I said, my voice softening just enough to remind them that this wasn't about revenge, but things are going to change. I closed the folder and stood up, letting them sit with the reality that the woman they had belittled for 30 years now held their future in her hands. "I'll explain everything tomorrow. Tonight, I suggest you all get some rest," and with that, I walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who finally saw me for who I truly was. Not the outsider, not the burden, but the one person they could no longer afford to underestimate. The next morning, the Thompson estate was unusually quiet. No clinking of fine china, no hushed conversations in the hallways, just silence, heavy and uncertain. I took my time, let them stew in it. By mid-morning, I called for a family meeting in the drawing room. This time, I sat at the center, no longer on the sidelines. They trickled in one by one. Beatrice looked like she hadn't slept. Thomas was still processing, his eyes darting between me and the floor. The rest of the family, siblings, spouses, wore expressions of confusion mixed with pride, swallowed by fear. I waited until everyone was seated before I spoke. "I know last night was a shock." I began, my tone calm but firm. I didn't reveal this to humiliate anyone, but it's time we face reality. Beatrice straightened in her chair, clinging to the last remnants of authority. So, what's your intention, Eleanor? Are you planning to sell the estate out from under us? I met her gaze without flinching. No, I'm not interested in destroying this family. Despite everything, this estate has history and potential. I pulled out a set of blueprints and financial projections from my folder, spreading them across the coffee table. For years, I've watched this property drain resources because it was treated like a relic, but it doesn't have to be. They leaned in curiosity overcoming pride. I propose we convert the estate into a boutique hotel and event venue. I continued, this house isn't just a symbol of old money, it's prime real estate in a historic district. People will pay top dollar to experience this kind of grandeur. There was a murmur around the room, some skeptical, others intrigued. Thomas finally spoke up, his voice cautious. And what happens to us? I nodded, expecting the question, you'll stay. Each family member will have private living quarters within the estate, but the rest will be renovated for guests, weddings, corporate retreats, whatever brings in revenue. Beatrice scoffed. You expect us to live in a hotel to work like staff? I smiled politely. I expect you to contribute. Everyone will have a role. Management, marketing, event planning. This isn't charity, it's business. Her face flushed with indignation, but she didn't argue. Because deep down, she knew the alternative was worse. I've already secured the necessary permits, I added. My team is ready to begin renovations within the month. You'll receive a share of the profits based on participation. The more you contribute, the more you earn. Thomas's younger sister, Margaret, spoke up, her tone hesitant but practical. And if we refuse, I didn't hesitate. Then you'll be treated like any tenant in default. Eviction notices will follow. The room fell silent again. I let that sink in, not as a threat, but as a fact. For years they had lived under the illusion of security, believing their name and lineage would shield them forever. Now they had to face the truth that survival required effort, not entitlement. Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line. She was proud, but she wasn't stupid. And you'll be in charge, she asked bitterly. Yes, I replied without apology. I've invested too much to hand over control. But I'm offering all of you a chance, not just to stay, but to rebuild. Thomas looked at me differently now. There was a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years, respect. Slowly heads began to nod. Even those who resented the idea realized it was the only viable path forward. Beatrice was the last to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. You planned this all along, didn't you? I shook my head. No? Beatrice? I planned for my future. It's not my fault you never thought I was capable of having one without you. With that, the meeting ended. They had their terms. Now it was up to them to decide whether pride was worth losing everything. In the weeks that followed, the transformation began. Renovation crews arrived, guided by my designs. Rooms were reimagined, spaces repurposed. The grand halls that once hosted elitist gatherings were now being prepared to welcome paying guests. I assigned roles based on skills, real or potential. Margaret took to event coordination surprisingly well. Thomas handled logistics, finally stepping out of his family's shadow. Even Beatrice begrudgingly offered her expertise in maintaining the estate's historical authenticity, though she made sure everyone knew it was her legacy being preserved. The dynamic shifted with every passing day. No longer was I the quiet outsider. I was the architect, not just of buildings, but of this family's survival. And while they still struggled to fully accept it, they followed my lead because now they had no choice. This wasn't just about saving the estate, it was about redefining who held the true power in the Thompson family. And for once, it wasn't a name carved into old stone. It was me. 6 months later, the Thompson estate didn't look like the same place. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled, but now laughter echoed through the halls, not just from entitled family gatherings, but from guests marveling at the grandeur they were paying top dollar to experience. Opening day arrived faster than anyone expected. What was once a decaying symbol of old money had been reborn as the Thompson Heritage Inn, a boutique hotel that blended history with modern elegance. As I walked through the lobby, watching guests check in, photographers capturing every angle, and staff moving efficiently through their routines, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt vindicated. Beatrice stood near the grand staircase, dressed impeccably as always, giving a tour to a group of investors. She spoke passionately about the estate's history, pointing out architectural details, never mentioning that I was the one who preserved it. But that was fine. I didn't need her praise. Thomas approached me holding 2 glasses of champagne. "For the lady of the house," he said, with a soft smile, handing me one. I raised an eyebrow. "Lady of the hotel, you mean?" He chuckled, a sound that had been rare in recent years. I have to admit, I never saw this coming. I took a sip, letting the moment settle between us. "You never needed to," I replied. "You just needed to believe I was capable." There was no bitterness in my voice, just truth. Thomas nodded, his expression more serious now. "I do believe that, more than ever." Before I could respond, Margaret hurried over, a clipboard in hand and a spark in her eye I'd never seen before. "We just booked 2 weddings and a corporate retreat for next month," she said, almost breathless. "This is really happening." I smiled genuinely at her. Margaret had surprised me the most, embracing her role, stepping up where others hesitated. Beatrice, on the other hand, had been slower to adjust. At first, she treated the project like a temporary inconvenience, something beneath her. But as the reservations piled up and the estate buzzed with life, even she couldn't deny the success. Of course, she still found ways to remind everyone of her standards. Just last week, I overheard her scolding a staff member about the floral arrangements being a touch too modern for a place of such heritage. Old habits die hard. But the real climax didn't come from the grand opening or the flood of guests. It came one evening when Beatrice knocked on my office door. I looked up, genuinely surprised to see her there alone. She stepped inside, her posture as rigid as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, not defeat, not resentment, something closer to acceptance. "I wanted to speak with you." She began, her voice measured. I set my paperwork aside and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I misjudged you, Eleanor." The words hung in the air, heavier than any insult she'd ever thrown my way. "I was raised to believe that pedigree mattered more than capability," she continued, "and for that I treated you unfairly." I studied her face, searching for any hint of sarcasm, but there was none. This was as close to an apology as Beatrice Thompson would ever offer. "I don't need an apology," I said quietly. "I just needed a chance to show you who I really am." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Well, you've done that, more than I ever expected." She stood, smoothing her skirt, the conversation clearly difficult for her pride to endure. Before she left, she paused at the door. "For what it's worth, this family owes you more than it will ever admit." And with that, she was gone. I sat there for a while, letting her words sink in. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There were no shouting matches or tears, just 2 women who had finally, after 30 years, seen each other clearly. The fallout wasn't about broken relationships or burned bridges. It was about transformation. The Thompsons learned that survival wasn't guaranteed by a name or legacy. It was earned through adaptability, through work, through respect. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's success. It's standing tall in the very place where others tried to keep you small, and knowing you didn't just survive, you thrived. As I looked out the window at the estate now, alive with purpose, I realized that I hadn't just saved a house, I had redefined a family. On my terms, looking back now, I realize I never set out to prove anything to my in-laws. When I made that first investment all those years ago, it wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about securing my independence quietly on my own terms. But life has a way of bringing things full circle. For 30 years, I was the woman they overlooked, the one they dismissed at every conversation, every decision. And yet, when everything crumbled, it wasn't their wealth or their pride that saved them, it was the person they underestimated the most. I didn't need to raise my voice, I didn't need to humiliate them, even though I had every reason to, because real strength isn't loud, it's steady, it's patient, it's knowing who you are even when others refuse to see it. Becoming their landlord wasn't the victory. The true victory was watching them adapt, watching a family built on arrogance, learn humility and cooperation. And for me, it was the quiet satisfaction of standing in that estate, not as an outsider but as the foundation holding it all together. I learned that sometimes the best response to years of disrespect isn't retaliation, it's resilience, it's success, so undeniable that even your harshest critics have no choice but to acknowledge it, if only in silence. If you're listening to this and you've ever been underestimated, if you've been made to feel small in rooms where you knew you didn't belong, let me tell you this: you don't need their approval, you don't need their recognition, you just need to believe in your own worth long enough to build something they can't ignore. What would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have chosen revenge or transformation? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of resilience and quiet triumphs here on Outlaw Alley. Because sometimes the best stories aren't about shouting back, they're about rising above.